The morning mist hung over the Palace of Meridian as Queen Isabella prepared for what she believed would be a routine charity event. She had spent 3 years trying to prove herself worthy of the crown, fighting against whispers that she was nothing more than a fortunate commoner who had caught the king's eye during his period of grief. The death of his first wife, Queen Catherine, had left the entire kingdom mourning, and Isabella knew she could never truly replace her in the people's hearts. As she adjusted her sapphire necklace in the ornate mirror of her private chambers, Isabella reflected on the conversation she had overheard the night before. She had been walking through the palace corridors when she heard voices coming from the private study. What she discovered would change everything she thought she knew about the royal family. Princess Sophia, the king's younger sister, had always been cordial but distant with Isabella. Known throughout the kingdom for her unwavering dedication to royal protocol and her sharp intelligence, Sophia commanded respect from both the public and foreign dignitaries. She had never married, dedicating her entire life to serving the crown and supporting her brother's reign. That evening, Isabella had heard Sophia speaking in hushed tones with her private secretary, discussing documents that seemed to contain information about the late Queen Catherine's final days. The conversation was fragmented, but certain words stood out clearly: hidden letters, the truth about the accident, and, most shocking of all, what really happened that night. Isabella's hands trembled as she remembered the rest of what she had overheard. There were suggestions that the car accident that claimed Queen Catherine's life might not have been the tragic mishap the public believed it to be. Sophia seemed to possess evidence that could potentially rewrite the official narrative that had been accepted for over 5 years. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on Isabella as she made her way to breakfast. King Edmund sat at the head of the table, reading morning reports with the same dignified composure he had maintained throughout his 40-year reign. His silver hair caught the light from the crystal chandelier, and, for a moment, Isabella saw him as the man she had fallen in love with rather than the monarch whose every move was scrutinized by the world. Prince Alexander, their eldest son and heir to the throne, joined them shortly after. At 28, he possessed his father's strong jaw and his late mother's gentle eyes. He had grown up in the shadow of his mother's tragic death and had always maintained a close relationship with his Aunt Sophia, who had helped raise him during the most difficult period of his life. The breakfast conversation remained pleasantly mundane until Sophia herself entered the dining room. Isabella watched carefully as the princess greeted her brother with their usual warm embrace, but there was something different in Sophia's demeanor. Her movements seemed more calculated, her smile more forced than genuine. As they discussed the day's official engagements, Isabella found herself studying Sophia's face for any hint of what she might be planning. The princess spoke eloquently about her upcoming visit to the National Archives, mentioning casually that she would be reviewing historical documents for her upcoming speech about royal transparency and accountability. The irony was not lost on Isabella. Here was a woman speaking about transparency while potentially holding secrets that could shake the very foundation of the monarchy. The question that tormented Isabella was whether she should confront Sophia directly or try to uncover the truth through other means. After breakfast, as the royal family dispersed to their various duties, Isabella made a decision that would set events in motion. She would use her position and access to palace resources to investigate what Sophia knew. If there were indeed secrets about Queen Catherine's death, Isabella felt she had a right to know, not just as the current queen, but as someone who had lived in the shadow of her predecessor's perfect memory. The palace suddenly felt different to Isabella as she walked through its halls. Every portrait of Queen Catherine seemed to watch her with knowing eyes, and every whispered conversation between staff members made her wonder if she was the only one who had been kept in the dark. The ornate walls that had once made her feel privileged now seemed to close in around her, hiding secrets in their shadows. As she entered her private office, Isabella began to formulate a plan. She would need to be careful and strategic, using her relationships with palace staff and her access to official records to piece together the truth. She had no idea that her investigation would ultimately lead to revelations that would test every relationship in the royal family and force King Edmund to confront truths he had buried for years. The afternoon brought the charity event Isabella had been dreading all morning. As she smiled and shook hands with dignitaries, her mind remained focused on the mystery she was determined to solve. Every public appearance now felt like a performance, with the weight of hidden knowledge making even simple conversations feel loaded with meaning. That evening, as Isabella prepared for bed, she made her first move in what would become a dangerous game of royal politics and family secrets. She quietly contacted her most trusted lady-in-waiting and asked her to discreetly gather any records related to Queen Catherine's final weeks. The investigation had begun, and there would be no turning back. 3 days had passed since Isabella began her quiet investigation, and what she discovered made her question everything she thought she knew about her husband's family. Her trusted aide, Lady Margaret, had managed to access several files from the palace archives that painted a troubling picture of the weeks leading up to Queen Catherine's death. The official reports had always stated that Queen Catherine died instantly in a single-car accident on a rainy night while returning from a private charity visit. However, the documents Lady Margaret uncovered revealed that Queen Catherine had been receiving anonymous, threatening letters in the months before her death, letters that had been quietly investigated by palace security but never made public. More disturbing still was a series of private correspondence between Queen Catherine and her closest friend, Lady Elizabeth Thornfield, in which Catherine expressed fears about certain members of the royal household. In one particularly chilling letter dated just 2 weeks before her death, Catherine wrote about feeling watched and judged, and mentioned that she had discovered something that could change everything about the royal family's public image. Isabella found herself pacing her private chambers as she processed this information. The woman she had been taught to revere as the perfect queen, the standard against which she was constantly measured, had apparently been living in fear during her final weeks. The tragedy that had shaped the royal family for years might have been something far more sinister than a simple accident. Meanwhile, Princess Sophia had been conducting her own careful campaign of revelation. She had arranged a series of private meetings with select members of parliament, journalists she trusted, and even foreign diplomats. Her approach was methodical and strategic, laying groundwork for what she clearly intended to be a major disclosure. King Edmund remained unaware of both his wife's investigation and his sister's preparations. He went about his royal duties with the same steadfast dedication that had defined his reign, attending state functions and meeting with government ministers, while the two most important women in his life moved closer to a collision that would devastate him. Prince Alexander, however, had begun to notice the subtle changes in the palace atmosphere. His Aunt Sophia seemed more focused and determined than usual, while his stepmother Isabella appeared distracted and occasionally startled during family gatherings. Having grown up in the royal household, Alexander had developed an acute sensitivity to the undercurrents of palace politics. The breakthrough in Isabella's investigation came when Lady Margaret discovered a sealed envelope hidden in Queen Catherine's personal effects, items that had been stored in a private vault and rarely accessed since her death. The envelope contained photographs, bank statements, and a detailed letter in Catherine's handwriting that would prove to be explosive. According to Catherine's letter, she had discovered evidence of significant financial irregularities involving certain royal charities and offshore accounts. More shocking still, she had reason to believe that Princess Sophia was not only aware of these irregularities, but was actively involved in covering them up. The letter suggested that Catherine had been planning to bring this information to light, regardless of the damage it might cause to the monarchy's reputation. Isabella sat in stunned silence as she read Catherine's final letter. The perfect queen had been prepared to expose corruption within her own family, even knowing it could bring down the institution she had served faithfully for over 2 decades. The implications were staggering, not just for Sophia's reputation, but for the entire royal family's credibility. The letter also contained Catherine's suspicions about her own safety. She wrote that she had received warnings to drop the investigation, and that she feared for what might happen if she continued pursuing the truth. Her final words in the letter were haunting. "If something happens to me, know that I tried to do what was right for the kingdom, even if it meant sacrificing myself for the truth." Armed with this devastating information, Isabella faced an impossible choice. She could confront Sophia directly, risking a confrontation that might tear the family apart, or she could take the evidence to King Edmund first, knowing it would shatter his faith in his beloved sister. There was also the option of making the information public, but that could destroy the monarchy itself. As Isabella wrestled with her decision, Princess Sophia was making final preparations for her own revelation. However, Sophia's version of the truth was carefully crafted to protect her own interests while still appearing to champion transparency. She had prepared a narrative in which she would position herself as someone who had only recently discovered troubling information about certain palace operations and felt compelled to speak out in the interest of royal accountability. The irony was bitter. Both women were preparing to expose secrets, but their motivations and their versions of the truth were dramatically different. Sophia sought to control the narrative and maintain her position of moral authority, while Isabella struggled with evidence that could implicate the princess in something far more serious than financial impropriety. Prince Alexander's growing awareness of the tension finally led him to approach his stepmother directly. In a private conversation in the palace gardens, he gently asked if something was troubling her. Isabella found herself torn between her desire to protect him from painful truths and her need for an ally who understood the complex dynamics of the royal family. The week concluded with Isabella making a fateful decision. She would confront Princess Sophia privately, presenting the evidence she had uncovered and demanding the complete truth about Queen Catherine's death and the financial irregularities. This confrontation would either lead to a private resolution or escalate into something that could destroy the royal family's carefully maintained facade. As Isabella prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life, she had no way of knowing that Sophia had already set her own plans in motion. The princess had scheduled a private meeting with the kingdom's most respected investigative journalist for the following week, intending to release her own version of events before anyone else could challenge her narrative. The stage was set for a collision between two women who both believed they were fighting for truth and justice, but whose versions of reality were destined to create chaos within the walls of the Palace of Meridian. The confrontation between Isabella and Princess Sophia took place in the princess's private study, a room lined with leather-bound books and portraits of previous monarchs who seemed to watch disapprovingly from their gilded frames. Isabella had chosen the early morning hours when the rest of the palace was quiet, hoping to keep their conversation away from curious ears. Sophia received Isabella with her usual composed politeness, offering tea and inquiring about her stepmother-in-law's health with the practiced grace of someone who had spent decades in royal service. However, Isabella could see the calculating intelligence behind Sophia's eyes, the same sharp awareness that had made her such an effective royal representative for so many years. "I know about the letters," Isabella said without preamble, placing copies of Queen Catherine's final correspondence on Sophia's mahogany desk. "I know about the financial investigations, and I know Catherine was afraid for her life." For the first time in years, Princess Sophia's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. Her hand paused halfway to her teacup, and Isabella saw a flash of genuine surprise cross her features before the royal mask slipped back into place. "I'm not sure what you think you've discovered," Sophia replied carefully, "but I would caution you against jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information." Isabella had prepared for this response. She produced additional documents, bank statements showing suspicious transfers, correspondence between Sophia and offshore financial advisors, and most damning of all, a recording device that had been found among Catherine's personal effects, containing a conversation between the late queen and someone whose voice was unmistakably Sophia's. The recording was brief, but devastating. In it, Catherine confronted Sophia about the financial irregularities, and Sophia's response was cold and threatening. "You have no idea what you're risking," Sophia's voice said through the static. "The monarchy has survived for centuries because we understand that some truths are too dangerous to reveal. I would think very carefully about whether you want to be remembered as the queen who destroyed everything our family has built." As the recording played, Isabella watched Sophia's face transform. The mask of royal dignity fell away, revealing something harder and more calculating underneath. When the recording ended, the two women sat in heavy silence while morning light filtered through the tall windows. "Catherine was naive," Sophia finally said, her voice carrying none of its usual warmth. "She thought she could expose financial arrangements that had been in place for decades without understanding the consequences. The money that flows through those accounts funds intelligence operations, protects state secrets, and maintains relationships that keep this kingdom safe. She would have destroyed us all for the sake of her precious principles." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine as she realized she was hearing the truth at last. "So you had her killed?" "I had her stopped," Sophia corrected with chilling precision. "The accident was meant to be a warning, a way to make her understand how serious the situation was. It was never supposed to result in her death." The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Isabella found herself unable to breathe as the full horror of what she was hearing settled over her. The woman sitting across from her, who had helped raise Prince Alexander and had been a trusted advisor to King Edmund for decades, was confessing to involvement in Queen Catherine's murder. "You're going to tell my brother," Sophia continued, and it's going to destroy him. He loved Catherine more than his own life, and learning that his sister was responsible for her death will break something in him that can never be repaired. Is that really what you want? Isabella realized that this was the trap Sophia had been setting from the beginning. By forcing Isabella to be the one to reveal the truth, Sophia was ensuring that Isabella would be seen as the destroyer of the family's peace, the outsider who brought chaos to the royal household. What's your alternative? Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew. We maintain the status quo, Sophia said calmly. Catherine's death remains a tragic accident. The financial arrangements continue as they have for decades, and the monarchy remains stable. You return to your royal duties, and we never speak of this again. But Isabella had underestimated the depth of Sophia's planning. Unknown to her, the princess had been recording their entire conversation, and she now had evidence of Isabella's wild accusations and unfounded conspiracy theories that could be used to question the queen's mental stability if necessary. I've already scheduled meetings with certain journalists, Sophia continued, to discuss concerning changes I've observed in your behavior recently. Your increasing paranoia, your obsession with Catherine's memory, your desperate need to find fault with others to justify your own insecurities. It would be tragic if the queen were to suffer some kind of nervous breakdown. But these things do happen, especially to those who weren't born to handle the pressures of royal life. The threat was clear and expertly delivered. Isabella could expose Sophia's crimes, but doing so would likely result in her own credibility being destroyed and her removal from her position as queen. Sophia had spent decades perfecting the art of royal politics, and she was demonstrating just how thoroughly she could outmaneuver someone who had only recently entered this world. However, Isabella had one advantage that Sophia hadn't considered. She had shared Catherine's evidence with Lady Margaret before the confrontation, with instructions to take everything to Prince Alexander if Isabella didn't return from her meeting by noon. As if summoned by her thoughts, Prince Alexander's voice could be heard in the corridor outside, approaching Sophia's study with what sounded like determined purpose. Isabella realized that her ally had arrived earlier than planned, and the careful balance of power in the room was about to shift dramatically. The door opened without ceremony, and Prince Alexander entered with Lady Margaret close behind him. In his hands were copies of all the documents Isabella had discovered, and his face bore an expression of fury and betrayal that made him look more like his father than ever before. Aunt Sophia, he said, his voice deadly quiet, I think you need to explain why my mother's last letter accuses you of threatening her life. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Isabella realized that regardless of how it ended, the royal family would never be the same. The secrets that had been buried for years were finally coming to light, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of the Palace of Meridian. The silence that followed Prince Alexander's question seemed to stretch for an eternity. Princess Sophia sat frozen at her desk, surrounded by the evidence of her crimes, while 3 pairs of eyes waited for an explanation that could never truly justify what she had done. Prince Alexander moved further into the room, his royal training keeping his voice level despite the rage that was clearly building inside him. I want to hear you say it, he demanded. I want to hear you admit what you did to my mother. Sophia's decades of royal discipline served her well in that moment. Rather than break down or attempt to deny what was now undeniable, she straightened in her chair and met her nephew's gaze with something approaching defiance. Your mother was going to destroy everything, she said quietly. The monarchy, the kingdom, the carefully balanced relationships that keep us safe from our enemies. She was prepared to sacrifice all of that for the sake of what she called moral clarity. Lady Margaret gasped audibly from her position near the door, but Alexander held up a hand to keep her silent. His focus remained entirely on his aunt, the woman who had comforted him after his mother's funeral and helped him understand his future role as king. She was my mother, Alexander said, each word carefully controlled. She was your brother's wife. She was a good woman who believed in doing what was right. She was naive, Sophia replied, her voice gaining strength. And her naivety would have cost thousands of lives if I had allowed her to expose operations that our allies depend on for their survival. The money she was so concerned about funds intelligence networks that prevent terrorist attacks, overthrows hostile governments, and maintains the delicate balance that keeps this kingdom prosperous and safe. Isabella watched this exchange with growing horror, realizing that Sophia genuinely believed she had been protecting the greater good. The princess wasn't a simple criminal motivated by greed or power. She was someone who had convinced herself that murder was justified in service of national security. Even if that were true, Alexander said, his composure finally beginning to crack, you had no right to make that choice. You had no right to take her from us. I had every right. Sophia snapped, rising from her chair with sudden fury. I have spent 40 years serving this crown, making the hard choices that your father couldn't make, protecting him from knowledge that would have paralyzed him with doubt. I have sacrificed everything, marriage, children, a normal life, to ensure that this monarchy survives in a world that would love to see us fall. The passionate outburst revealed the depth of resentment that Sophia had been carrying for decades. Isabella began to understand that this wasn't just about financial irregularities or even Catherine's death. It was about a woman who felt that her sacrifices had never been properly recognized or appreciated. The arrangement with the offshore accounts was created by our grandfather during World War II. Sophia continued, her voice now carrying a lecturer's tone. It has been maintained by every monarch since then, because it serves purposes that go far beyond simple financial gain. Catherine discovered it by accident and immediately assumed the worst, refusing to listen to explanations about why such arrangements are necessary. Prince Alexander moved closer to his aunt, and Isabella could see tears beginning to form in his eyes. You could have told her the truth. You could have explained it to her properly instead of threatening her. I tried, Sophia said, her voice softening slightly. She wouldn't listen. She had already made up her mind that we were all corrupt, that the monarchy was built on lies and criminal activity. She was planning to go public with incomplete information that would have been twisted by our enemies to justify everything they've ever said about us. The room fell silent again as everyone processed what they were hearing. Isabella found herself struggling with the complexity of the situation. Sophia's actions were unforgivable, but her motivations weren't entirely selfish. She had genuinely believed she was protecting the kingdom, even if her methods were monstrous. The accident, Alexander said quietly. Tell me exactly what happened. Sophia returned to her chair, suddenly, looking every one of her 63 years. I arranged for her car to have a minor mechanical failure on that particular route. The idea was that she would be stranded for a few hours, giving us time to arrange a private conversation away from the palace. She was supposed to be frightened, not hurt. But something went wrong, Isabella said, speaking for the first time since Alexander's arrival. The rain was heavier than expected, Sophia admitted. When the brakes failed, she couldn't control the car on the wet road. It was supposed to be a gentle slide into a ditch, not. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Prince Alexander turned away from his aunt, walking to the tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens where he had played as a child, while his mother watched from these same windows. The weight of responsibility for what came next was settling on his shoulders, and Isabella could see him struggling with the impossible choice between family loyalty and justice. Father doesn't know, Alexander said. It wasn't a question. Your father has never known, Sophia confirmed. And if you tell him, it will destroy him. He's 71 years old, Alexander. Learning that his sister murdered his beloved wife will kill him, if not physically then, spiritually. He'll never recover from that betrayal. This was the final cruel twist in Sophia's web of manipulation. Even in defeat, she was using love as a weapon, forcing Alexander to choose between justice for his mother and protection for his father. Isabella realized that this had probably been Sophia's contingency plan from the beginning. If she were ever discovered, she would make the cost of revelation so high that silence would seem like the more compassionate choice. There's another option, Isabella said suddenly, an idea forming in her mind. All three pairs of eyes turned to her as she began to outline a plan that would satisfy justice while protecting King Edmund from the truth that would devastate him. The conversation that followed would determine not just Sophia's fate, but the future of the monarchy itself. In the end, the decision they reached would forever change the relationship between truth and duty within the royal family, setting precedents that future generations would have to live with long after the current crisis had passed. The plan that Isabella proposed was both elegant and terrible in its complexity. Princess Sophia would be given a choice: voluntary exile or public exposure of her crimes. If she chose exile, she would quietly retire from public life, claiming health issues, and would live out her remaining years in a remote royal property under discreet supervision. Her financial assets would be frozen, and the offshore accounts would be transferred to legitimate charitable organizations under independent oversight. Most importantly, King Edmund would be told a modified version of the truth. He would learn about the financial irregularities and the cover-up, but would be led to believe that Catherine's death was indeed an accident, one that Sophia had tried to prevent but failed to stop in time. The guilt over this failure would serve as Sophia's punishment in Edmund's eyes, while protecting him from the knowledge that would destroy his faith in family entirely. Prince Alexander struggled with this compromise for hours, walking the palace corridors as he had done as a troubled teenager, seeking clarity in the familiar rhythms of his childhood home. The weight of his future crown had never felt heavier than it did that morning, as he contemplated the first major moral decision of what would likely someday be his reign. In the end, it was Isabella who convinced him that protecting his father was worth the sacrifice of perfect justice. Your mother would want him to have peace in his final years, she argued. She loved him too much to want him destroyed by the truth of her death. Sophia accepted the terms with a dignity that surprised everyone. Perhaps she had been carrying the guilt for so long that exile felt like a relief, or perhaps she recognized that the alternative would mean not just her own destruction, but potentially the end of the monarchy she had spent her life serving. The conversation with King Edmund took place that evening in his private study, the same room where he had proposed to Isabella years earlier. Alexander and Isabella sat across from him as they carefully revealed the existence of the financial irregularities and Sophia's involvement in covering them up. Edmund's reaction was everything they had feared and more. The strong, dignified man who had led the kingdom for 4 decades seemed to age 10 years in the space of that conversation. His faith in his sister, his closest advisor and confidant, crumbled as they showed him evidence of her deception. She was trying to protect the monarchy, Isabella explained gently, following the script they had carefully prepared. The arrangements were made for national security purposes, but Catherine discovered them and misunderstood their purpose. Sophia was afraid that public revelation would damage relationships with our allies. And Catherine's death? Edmund asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia was rushing to meet with Catherine that night, trying to arrange a private conversation to explain everything, Alexander said, hating himself for the lie even as he recognized its necessity. She believes that if she had reached Catherine sooner, if she had been able to explain the situation properly, the accident might never have happened. Edmund sat in silence for a long time, processing this information through the lens of his love for both women. In his mind, he was reconstructing years of interactions, conversations, and decisions, trying to understand how he had missed the signs of such deep deception within his own family. "Where is Sophia now?" he finally asked. "She's requested time to consider her position," Isabella replied. "She's deeply ashamed of her role in these events, and feels that she may no longer be fit to serve the crown." 3 days later, Princess Sophia made her final public appearance at a charity event for military veterans, a cause she had supported throughout her royal career. She spoke eloquently about service, sacrifice, and the sometimes painful choices that duty requires, though only 3 people in the audience understood the deeper meaning of her words. Her retirement was announced the following week, attributed to health concerns and a desire to spend her remaining years in quiet reflection. The public received the news with genuine sadness, as Sophia had been a beloved figure known for her intelligence, dedication, and unwavering support of the crown. King Edmund visited his sister one final time before her departure to the remote estate that would become her prison. Their conversation remained private, but those who saw them together noted that while there were tears, there was also a tenderness that spoke to the complex love between siblings who had shared a lifetime of royal duty. In the months that followed, the royal family slowly adapted to their new reality. King Edmund seemed more fragile than before, but he found comfort in spending increased time with Isabella and Alexander, as if their presence helped fill the void left by Sophia's absence. Isabella discovered that keeping such a monumental secret changed her in unexpected ways. She found herself more confident in her role as queen, having proven to herself that she could navigate the treacherous waters of royal politics when necessary. However, she also carried the weight of knowing that their solution, while protecting Edmund, had denied Catherine the justice she deserved. Prince Alexander threw himself into his royal duties with new intensity, as if preparing for the increased responsibilities he would someday inherit. The experience had aged him, giving him a deeper understanding of the moral complexity that royal leadership sometimes required. The offshore financial arrangements were quietly reformed, brought under proper oversight and transparency while maintaining their essential functions. Catherine's investigation had not been in vain. even if she would never receive public credit for the changes she had died trying to implement. As autumn arrived at the Palace of Meridian, the royal family had found a new equilibrium based on partial truths and carefully managed secrets. They had learned that sometimes love requires difficult choices, and that justice is not always the same thing as truth. Isabella often stood at the windows of Queen Catherine's former chambers, now converted to a private memorial room, and wondered if they had made the right choice. In those quiet moments, she liked to think that Catherine would understand the decision to protect Edmund, even if she might not have approved of the methods. The kingdom continued to prosper under Edmund's wise rule, though those closest to him noticed that he had lost some of the easy confidence that had characterized his earlier years. The revelations about the financial arrangements had been handled with typical royal discretion, and the public remained unaware of the family drama that had played out behind palace walls. In the end, the story of secrets revealed had become a story of secrets transformed, some exposed to light, others buried deeper than ever, and the royal family forever changed by their encounter with truths too dangerous for complete revelation. The crown had survived, as it always had, but at a cost that would echo through the generations to come.